Kevin, you've written a book, presumably, ostensibly about Led Zeppelin, and yet it is about so much more. The title, Back to Schoolin', comes from the lyrics of a Led Zeppelin song. And what Led Zeppelin taught me about music sort of defines the range, the scope, the territory you're going to cover. In other words, it's a book about Led Zeppelin and what they meant to you, but you take it much further afield than that.
Yes.
What instigated you? What inspired you to write the book in the first place?
Many things. Being a fan, of course, for many years, since the late 70s, when I first discovered Led Zeppelin when I was about 14, and became an instant fan. Being a fan of the music is obvious. The band was, I grew up on a lot of different musics before that, and I felt like everything I got into before that was leading me to them as sort of the apex of what rock music had to offer in the 1970s, and really, to me, in all of rock music throughout its history. And Led Zeppelin was much more than just a band that wrote great music and put out albums, did concerts. They were really a schooling for me when it comes to learning about music. Now, when I first got into them, I had a little bit of background on music in grade school, took trumpet lessons and played trumpet for a few years. But once you get into high school, I played trumpet from 5th to 8th grade. Once you get into high school, trumpet's really not that cool. I regret actually having given the instrument up at this point. But at that point, I was so fully immersed in rock music, along with my friends, or the most influential friends. And Led Zeppelin became the band for a whole group of us. It was like a little gang of us. And then it was pick up the guitar.
Was there a seminal moment as a Zeppelin fan? Was there a particular song that lit you up and you knew this was the group you wanted to invest yourself in?
That's a tough question to answer because there's so many, but I do remember specifically a couple of songs. It was more particularly the album that converted me to Led Zeppelin as a full fan was their album Physical Graffiti from 1975, a double album. I think I don't know if I can say most, but many of us in the Zeppelin world believe that's their masterpiece. It was the album they were leading up to. By the time they put out that album, it was their definitive statement. And there's plenty of tracks on that album that stand out, especially for me. One of them is called In the Light, which is a fascinating synthesis of Eastern and Western music. The members of Zeppelin, particularly Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and John Paul Jones, were very fascinated with music from all over the world. And that song is a fusion of East and West. It has a drone section at the beginning, played on synthesizers, and it's a really mesmerizing piece of music. The same album, of course, has one that most people would know, Kashmir, which again is a fusion of Eastern and Western styles of music.
Very evocative piece of music.
Very provocative. It's evocative of so many things when you listen to it, of driving through the sand, as it says in the lyrics and so forth. So that album was particularly one that did it for me. The follow-up album called Presence, the closing track was a slow blues track called T for One. Robert Plant had suffered a severe car accident in summer of 1975 after the Physical Graffiti album came out, was sitting in a hospital bed, unable to move with a severely broken ankle. And he wrote those lyrics, T for One, about missing his wife because she couldn't be with him, and it was really devastating because she'd also been severely injured. But it was really my introduction to the blues, and as anybody who knows Led Zeppelin knows, that Led Zeppelin is steeped heavily in the blues from their origins. But that particular song, an original Page Plant composition, I remember being particularly mesmerized by that song. It was just powerful. Jimmy Page's solo was much more laid back and almost jazzy in places, and it was just really absorbing. So I'll never forget the impact that had. I remember even mentioning to my older brother, I was listening to this Led Zeppelin song, there was like real slow jam feel to it, because I didn't know what the blues were then. That's how ignorant I was at that point. And he had to say, well, that's blues. that's what that is. So it's kind of an introduction, and then once you get introduced to that, okay, this is the blues, or at least Led Zeppelin's take on it, then you've got a whole world, you know, when you go back to the earlier albums, the first couple albums particularly, very blues influenced. So that song on that album, the entire Physical Graffiti album, were particularly influential early on in cementing my appreciation of the band.
You've worked with me and my organization for years. I don't know how many, 10 or 15, I lost count.
15, yeah.
And principally as an actor. I also knew you as a writer and to some degree a director. And it was late in the day when I finally came to see you writing charts for your magnum opus that it occurred to me you had a profound interest in music.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised that you went ahead to express that through a book such as the one you've done. The question I would have for you, I think, given the subtitle of your book, what is the most profound awareness you come away with about music, having studied the Led Zeppelin songbook, for lack of a better?
Sure. Well, it's an excellent question. Again, it's hard to sum it up into one or two things, but the structure of the book has three main sections. The sections are the music, the presentation and relationships, and the business. And then there are multiple chapters within each of those sections. And that kind of sums up what I learned from them in a general sense is the multiplicity of approaches to music, the various, musical diversity, dynamics, the proper function of a rhythm section. It just goes on and on and on. Were all part of what I learned piece by piece from the band, primarily just through interviews and reading quotes from them and things they said that just stuck with me. This is before I started to pursue music myself. That then spread out to the way they presented their music through the album covers, through album titles, through even song titles, and also the relationships and how they handled the relationships amongst themselves, amongst the band with other people and other bands, and so forth. I started realizing how much I'd learned from them in that. And then the business side, of course, is an inescapable difficulty for any musician who considers himself an artist, and how they handled that, being able to balance out artistic integrity alongside the reality of commercial pressure. And all three of those main categories really sum up what I learned from them and put into the book. And I think one of the principal things, starting with the music category, was the musical diversity. There was probably to this day, no other band as musically diverse as Led Zeppelin. And the reason that to me that's important to point out to people is Led Zeppelin, to the average individual who just knows the name and maybe knows, of course, Whole Lotta Love and a few other tracks, Stairway to Heaven, whatever, have absolutely no idea the extent of musical diversity that is prevalent in that band and their music. It's extraordinary. You name a musical style and they embraced it and made use of it. And the beauty is they were able to take all of this incredible style, all this different diversity of music, and make it their own, and then present it to an audience through their own personal signature style. And to this day, I have a album CD collection today, that's really extensive of so-called world music from all over the world. I mean, you go around the world and I have examples of indigenous musics from around the world that I've steadily been purchasing over the years because of Led Zeppelin's desire to do the same thing and present that through their own music. And the truth is, this title, world music, and all this this mentality of wanting to approach one's own music by borrowing from musics around the world became really popular in the 1980s through people like Paul Simon and Peter Gabriel and others who did magnificent jobs with it. But it's not very well known that Led Zeppelin was doing this 10 years before that term world music was even coined, I think. And again, I mentioned earlier, In the Light, Indian influence, Kashmir, very Arabic influence, and it just goes on. They have Celtic influences. It's the sky's the limit, and they understood that.
As evident as it is that they've drawn from many musical disciplines and styles and genres, who's drawn from them most notably? And who reveals themselves as having taken from Led Zeppelin, for better or worse, to complement their own repertoire?
That's a very large list, and very difficult to try to name. The list would keep going on, and in the book, I actually have a section dealing with their legacy and the impact they had on others in the business section of the book. And that has come to the forefront in the last decade or so, as their popularity seems to be ubiquitous. I mean, bigger than it's ever been. And more bands and artists are acknowledging their debt to Zeppelin. I mean, they were during the time that Zeppelin was a band in the 70s. I think in the same way that the Beatles ruled the 60s and all the other bands, to whatever degree, looked up to the Beatles, perhaps a degree of hesitancy to admit it, perhaps not. It was the same thing in the 70s with Led Zeppelin. All the bands, to whatever degree, would have to acknowledge that they looked up to them as sort of the model. And there are specific bands that were very blatant about it, and Heart is a perfect example. In fact, they were known as the female Led Zeppelin because Ann and Nancy Wilson, the Wilson sisters who led the band, were unabashedly Led Zeppelin fanatics. And there's so much Led Zeppelin influence, but the whole band, they were deep admirers of Zeppelin. A band like Rush is an interesting band in that their early influence was very Led Zeppelin influence, a little more on the heavier side of rock. They, at the same time, were influenced by progressive rock bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and bands of that ilk, and they ended up eventually combining those two to create their own brand of hard rock that's sort of a progressive rock, hard rock fusion, and Zeppelin was a huge part of that, though, when it comes to the hard rock side. Bands that were contemporaries with Zeppelin throughout the 70s, Black Sabbath would owe a huge debt to Zeppelin. They'd be the first to admit it. Black Sabbath, I think, probably deserves to be considered the originators of what's known as heavy metal, which is a designate that's constantly attributed to Zeppelin, which they would not agree with, and neither do I. But Black Sabbath was clearly indebted to them, and they'd be the first to admit that. Aerosmith is a band that pays homage to Zeppelin constantly. Joe Perry, Steven Tyler. In fact, Steven Tyler actually roadied for the band the Yardbirds in the late 60s for a while when Jimmy Page was in the band, so he was familiar with Jimmy Page, followed his career, and then when Page founded Zeppelin in the late 60s, 68, they became a huge influence on members of Aerosmith later. So,
when you set out to write the book, you know that you are coming face to face with millions and millions of people who aren't just casual fans, but are dyed-in-the-wool Zeppelin, I don't know, acolytes, or in French they'd say les adeptes de Zeppelin, but Zeppelin followers. So I know you understood that you had to have your facts straight and your details correct, and your opinions were based on study and firsthand experience with your own music.
Sure.
What has been the reaction to the book that has come back to you from either publications that have reviewed it or people in the industry who've spoken about it?
Sure. I've had some very positive reviews from the book. It's been very satisfying. You mentioned that there's such a fan base. For a band like Led Zeppelin, it's not a niche band. This is a major leagues band here. And so one has a real responsibility in approaching a project like this to be as accurate as one can be, to present the facts properly, to learn how to balance between objectivity and subjectivity, which I mentioned in the introduction of the book quite a bit, trying to explain that process. So with that as a backdrop, entering the project was one where I knew, okay, what am I going to bring to this that other Zeppelin authors have had, that hasn't already been done? And the idea of presenting, well, this is what I learned from Led Zeppelin about music, as far as I understand, is virgin territory, has not been done before. And thankfully, the reviews that I've gotten have made reference to that. It is a unique approach, I believe. And even if it's not, I'm just glad to be a part of that library of books that are out there about the band. But the reviews, specifically, I got an excellent review. The first review I got actually was from a gentleman named Steve Sauer, S-A-U-E-R. He's a Zeppelin acolyte. He's much younger than me, so he came into the band years after, and he himself is a musician. He actually contacted me online about my book before I'd ever known anything about him, because he found me somehow online in the book. So I sent him a copy, and he has a Zeppelin website called Lemon Squeezings, and he was kind enough to write a very, very positive review for me that was put on his site in December of 2009 that covers a lot of what the book's about. He did an excellent job of, he got it. He got what it was about. It was about, this is what I learned from the band about music in its entirety, and I wanted to pass that on to another generation. What they taught me, I want others to learn. And he really encapsulated that very well.
I know you are currently making yourself available for speaking dates and lecturing about Zeppelin and obviously the content of the book, but much further afield than that. But with regard to a next book, would you return to the subject of Zeppelin? Have you said it all, or would you take in another group and give them the same treatment?
I've been pondering this, and part of the difficulty I'm running into is I have more ideas than I have time. I have at least 3 or 4 other music-themed books I really, really would love to be able to do, and it's a matter of deciding which one is the next one. But I have a strong desire to do a book about progressive rock music, which is a really huge, huge interest for me. And it's a much maligned music that I think has definitely not gotten a fair shake. I'd love to bring my own opinion on that to bear. One in particular that I'd like to do, and interestingly, all the books that I still would like to do have already been mentioned in seed form in Back to Schoolin as just organic part of what I'm talking about throughout the book. And this is a book about what I call the golden age of rock music, which for me was from 1966 to 1975. I believe that rock music reached its apex during that 10-year period, starting with the Beatles' Revolver album, which I think is their best album, up to Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti, which I think is their best album. And the period of that decade is astonishing in the level of creativity, the extraordinary musicianship and virtuosity of the players, the level of freedom that they had during that really precious period where there was very little record label interference and creativity sort of ruled the day. And that's when bands like Zeppelin and their peers, progressive rock bands, louder Beatles music, was allowed to flourish.
Well, Kevin, I've read Back to Schoolin more than once. When it first was issued, I went through it, and then later, with a little perspective, I went through it again. And I enjoyed it very much. And I want to thank you for making yourself available for this interview.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.